مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. رغم الاعتراض الدولي والتنديد الروسي، قررت واشنطن إمداد كييف بذخائر عنقودية محرمة دوليا، وبذلك دخلت الحرب الأوكرانية منحا جديدا رغم تقديم كييف لتعهدات مكتوبة بعدم استخدامها في المناطق المأهولة بالسكان. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة ينضم إلينا فرانك ليدويدج، المحلل العسكري والضابط السابق في الاستخبارات العسكرية البريطانية. سيد فرانك، مرحبا بك معنا.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
لماذا قررت أمريكا مد أوكرانيا بالذخائر العنقودية؟ هل هذا يضعها في تناقض أخلاقي حول هذه المسألة؟
Right. So there are the official reasons and the unofficial reasons. And the official reasons are that the Ukrainians asked for these weapons. They are effective or will be effective against Russian forces. Ukraine has not signed the Cluster Munitions Convention of 2008. The United States has not signed it. However, it is generally agreed that cluster weapons should not be deployed. So the official reason is the Ukrainians asked for it. The Americans have them. Neither party has signed up to the Cluster Munitions Convention. They are useful weapons. And there is, however, another unofficial reason. And that is this, that the Americans are, as with all Western suppliers of weapons, running short of artillery. The US has stockpiled thousands of these rounds, which otherwise would not be used. So the supply of these weapons would also help overall in Ukraine's ammunition requirements.
لاحظ أن القرار الأمريكي انتقدته حتى بريطانيا على استيحاء، ربما عندما ذكر سوناك أنه لا يشجع على استخدامها.
Right. UK is a signatory to the Cluster Munitions Convention. So we in the UK do not use cluster weapons because we would say they are indiscriminate. In other words, they may hit targets other than the one you've aimed at, in other words, civilians. And also, there is the reason that after the war, they will need to be cleaned up because many of the little bombs that come from the cluster rockets do not explode, so they stay in the ground. Many countries have the experience, Lebanon, for example, had the experience of having these things in the ground for many years. So those are the reasons why the UK would object, primarily though because we are in the UK a signatory to the Cluster Munitions Convention.
بعض وسائل الإعلام تحدثت عن تزويد واشنطن لكييف بمخزونها القديم. ما مدى صحة هذا الأمر وما معناه إن استخدم على الأرض؟
I think the answer is certainly yes. The category of weapons stockpiled in the US are likely to be quite old, perhaps in some cases decades, although they will be well maintained. And what this means is that a whole new category of weaponry opens up to be given to the Ukrainians. As I said before, the Americans are themselves running short of ammunition. So for them, they're highly likely to use ammunition themselves, the Americans, because most countries agree we shouldn't. So this allows them to open up their stocks from a long time ago to be handed over to the Ukrainians.
هناك من ربط القرار بالهجوم الأوكراني المضاد والذي تصفه بعض وسائل الإعلام بأنه لم يحقق الكثير على الأرض.
Yeah, I see that argument. Two things though. First, the Ukrainian offensive is not going as quickly as they would like. The truth is, however, it's within the framework of what they expected. I think we'll see a lot more progress in the next month or two as the Ukrainians deploy the bulk of their forces, the majority of their forces, which they have not yet deployed. So there is an element, yes, it's going more slowly than they hoped. And so the Ukrainians, however, are always, and quite understandably, asking for more. So, for example, they asked for, most recently, for fighter jets, they got them. They asked for long-range rockets, they got them from the UK and the US. They asked for certain kinds of missiles last year. They got them. And this is the latest expansion of their arsenal, of their weaponry. And this one is very important. To come back to your question, what it will allow the Ukrainians to do is to bombard Russian defenses much more efficiently than they have so far. It will allow them to, let's say, offset or compensate for their lack of ammunition, and particularly precision ammunition. So yes, these weapons will be used in that offensive. They're likely to be very effective in that role. However, it is also fair to say that they will cause a much greater problem later on when they need to be cleared up, when the combat areas need to be cleared. But, you know, they need to be cleared anyway. So to summarize, yes, this is to help the Ukrainian offensive. And yes, they will be useful. And we'll see if they make a difference in the next 6 weeks or so.
باعتقادك ما الذي يعنيه تزامن قرار أمريكا مد أوكرانيا بالذخائر العنقودية في الوقت الذي تخلصت فيه من الأسلحة الكيميائية؟ هل هذه ازدواجية أم أن السياسة الأمريكية باتت متضاربة في رسائلها؟
Yeah, a really controversial question. The Americans are highly, in fact, will not hand over any more of their arsenal of chemical weapons, which I believe they do retain. For what reason, I can't tell you. As you will know from your region, there are assertions that the Americans did supply the Iraqi regime in the 1980s with chemical weapons, but obviously that's a long time ago. The US, of course, is party to chemical weapons conventions and considers them illegal, so that they will not be handing over any chemical weapons to any other party. I would be 100% certain of that. It's worth remembering that the US is not party. It has not signed the cluster weapons or cluster munitions convention.
حتى أفهم منك أكثر، تحدثت عن فعالية هذه الذخائر. هل باعتقادك أنها ستقلب الكفة لصالح كييف؟ ما مدى تأثيرها ميدانياً؟
Yeah, that's a great question. And it raises this issue of game changers, as we say in English, key weapons, decisive weapons. I don't think there's any such thing as a decisive weapon. We heard about the so-called, well, not so-called, the HIMARS would change things. The Ukrainians say having jets will change things, or long-range missiles will be will be decisive. None of those weapons individually will be decisive, and the cluster munitions will not be decisive. But for sure, they will assist, particularly in two respects, the Ukrainian offensive. First, they will allow them to clear, and I hesitate to use these terms because it involves people being killed, clear Russian trench systems. In other words, you can use these to cover a much larger area than with normal artillery. Second, and just as importantly and closely connected, it will allow them to engage, as we say, or attack artillery positions so that the Ukrainians won't need to fire hundreds of shells to kill a Russian artillery position. It can fire one or two in the general area. It's worth saying and restating that the Ukrainians already use them, and they have not been decisive so far, and so do the Russians, because neither country, of course, is a party to this convention. So it won't bring a new capability. What it will do, though, is it will allow the Ukrainians to deploy and fire more of these weapons using the Western-supplied artillery they already have.
واشنطن أكدت حصولها على ضمانات من كييف بأن هذه الأسلحة التي حضرتها عدة دول لن تستخدم ضد المدنيين. هل يمكن ضمان هذا ميدانياً؟
Yeah, two things there. First, the evidence I've seen demonstrates that the Ukrainian army is very careful with civilian casualties because the civilians they're firing towards are always Ukrainian citizens. As you know, they've said they're not going to use these outside Ukrainian borders. So there's good evidence that they have genuine evidence that they try to avoid Ukrainian civilian casualties. Secondly, and this is quite important, most of the target areas, which are the Russian defensive lines in the south of the country, as you said earlier, towards Crimea, but not in it. The cluster rockets they're going to use don't have the range, I think, to get to Crimea. So the target areas are Russian defense lines. If you're going to construct proper defensive lines, you clear the civilians out. So it's highly likely that there'll be very few, if any, civilian targets in that area. The trouble will arise if they come to a city, say Tokmak, which is one of their target cities, or Melitopol, which is a big city. And you're going to face the choice of, well, do we use those weapons there? They're nowhere near getting to those target cities yet. But if they do, then that will be a real issue. Up to now, though, the targets are likely to be Russian artillery systems and Russian trench systems, and very few civilians will be in those areas.
بالمقابل، كيف تتوقع رد الفعل الروسي على هذه الخطوة؟
Well, the Russians are always threatening escalation or terrible, even more terrible responses. But it's difficult to see what conventional means they have that they're not using already. They already use thermobaric weapons, which are incendiary weapons, which suck the air out of a few hundred, many hundreds of square meters. They use, needless to say, cruise missiles against Ukrainian civilian targets. They have the full arsenal of their army, navy, and air force deployed against the Ukrainians. So they can't escalate conventionally. I don't think this is significant enough that they might consider doing something like an attack or some form of action against the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. I don't think this is significant enough for that. We could see some cyber attacks on the US or something like that. Some of the, what we could say, horizontal escalation, broadening the conflict. But again, I think they're not willing to take the US on this. And we'll hear a lot of words, but I doubt we'll see much more in the way of let's say, escalation. They just don't have those options anymore.
بمناسبة استخدام هذه الأسلحة من جديد، هل حان الوقت لإطلاق نداء عالمي لوقف استخدام الذخائر العنقودية؟
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, look, I think this is, to be frank, you're quite right. This is an exceptional case, and I've tried to outline the reasons why it's exceptional. The target areas are likely to be purely military, and those areas are going to need extensive clearance anyway. They're not very strong arguments, but I think they're legitimate in this case. But more globally, of course, you're entirely right, because you saw again in your region the use by Russians of cluster munitions, particularly in cities like Aleppo. It's exactly the kind of thing we want to avoid in Syria. And more globally, the conflicts, let's say, in really horrendous conflicts, such as are happening in Northeast Africa now, or indeed anywhere else in the world, we don't need cluster munitions there. So this, I think, at best is an exceptional case. And there's a very strong case, as you suggest, for simply banning them. But just in this case, the realities as such. Both sides are already using them. One side sees the military efficacy as very, very important to them. And the reality is that it also helps out the US problems with ammunition supply more broadly. So unfortunately, in this case, those realities intervene.
أستاذ فرانك ليدويدج، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
My pleasure. Thank you. Privilege.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.